the bees and the pollen wasp, they potentially originated in around the same geographic area too, this area of Western Gondwana. So we've got this was back when Africa and South America were basically touching until 100 million years ago or so and fitting together like puzzle pieces. And this was an arid, a drier region. So it's likely that from other analyses too, that the bees arose probably in that geographic region.
Uh-huh.
And the pollen wasps are also extremely speciose, especially in South Africa, and could have arisen around that area too.
From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Andony Melathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture.
Today, we're diving into the evolution of one of the insect world's most interesting career shifts with Dr. Elizabeth Murray. Dr. Murray is an assistant professor and curator of the mighty M.T. James Entomological Collection at Washington State University. Her research sits at the fascinating intersection of molecular phylogenetics and insect evolution. Now, while her expertise spans a wide array of insects in the order Hymenoptera, she's a leading voice on the evolution and diversification of pollen wasps. Today she'll be taking us into the unique world of these solitary wasps that have traded the predatory lifestyle for a life of floral specialization, this week on Pollination.
I'm really excited. We had a session with the master melathopologist last month where we talked on the topic we're talking today, and there was so much enthusiasm. But before we get into that topic, you're the director of the M.T. James Entomological Collection at Washington State University. Before we get into the topic, tell us about the collection.
Okay, yeah, I'd love to. So we have a research collection here on our campus. It's in Pullman, Washington. And it's the largest collection in the state and kind of the size of the OSU collection at Oregon State also. We have about 3 million specimens. And, you walk in and you can picture almost like a library, except we just have big, huge steel cabinets and they're full of insects. So we also do have books there too. But so we have all of these cabinets holding, you just pull out drawer after drawer of insects. They've got label data. We have insects basically across our insect tree of life, but especially strong in flies and in butterflies and moths, in beetles, and also then in our Hymenoptera, which is my special interest. And so that's our wasps, our ants, our bees, things like that. Yeah, and about our museum, we have a collections manager who works in there, and he really does the day-to-day operations. We host tour groups and visitors, members of the public who'd like to come in. We host scientific visitors, and basically, it's a working collection. So we send out loans, answer questions, and do things like that.
I imagine many people have not been, they think of the Smithsonian and they're really may not know that, Washington has this real resource. Maybe just a little bit about like how, why this matters for Washingtonians to have this collection and have this resource available to the state.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Yeah, that's a great point, because I should mention that our focus is also specifically quite regional, and we have really great representation from the state. We also do have a really strong collection of Guatemalan specimens, and that's because one of our longtime curators has been traveling there for many years. But really, we can add to any sort of data conservation issues, kind of add to the discussion on land use and things like that in the state, because we have specimens going back well over 100 years. Some of our oldest specimens basically just have a WT on the label for Washington Territory. So they would be before.
Wow.
And the places these specimens collected and just what species they are, what is their identity, that can tell us a lot about what has been here in the past, how have things changed, and you can kind of start to get a bigger picture too about what should we be studying or looking at within the state. So we do work with other agencies such as our Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife or Washington Department of Agriculture. And, when they need records or maybe they need to check a reference like a species ID, we work with some of these other institutions too.
I was excited when I came to visit. I saw the floor plans that there's a new compactor system that is being installed. Like there's a lot of things happening with the collection. It's very active and you're really
Yeah.
working on it.
Yeah, we're definitely trying to grow the collection. It's growing by tens of thousands of specimens every year right now, and that means you run out of space. That's the thing with these natural history collections. We are gathering specimens, year by year, and pretty soon you become a little space limited. But there are ways to deal with that, even just staying within the same footprint. And in this case, we have a generous donor who's helped to fund this new compactor system. So that's where I mentioned these steel cabinets. We basically put them on rails and you can kind of condense and open them and double or more the space that you have for storage in your room. So that is really integral to us going forward. For instance, we participate in our Washington Bee Atlas, and those volunteers have been doing great work for just a few years. They're getting like tens of thousands of specimens a year, and those will be deposited in our collection. And so, again, we just need room for growth and expansion, which is a great thing to do. And as we get those specimens, there's this label data, we can translate that into a kind of a digital format. People can access our specimen data online then too. Mhm.
That's super exciting. Well, okay, so I brought you here today. I did want to hear a little bit about the collection, but I want to talk about pollen wasps. And I know our listeners have heard repeatedly that bees evolved from wasp ancestors, and there was this big transition from animal protein and hunting to pollen. So, but then there are these pollen wasps. How do they fit into this story?
Yeah. Well, they really have a parallel story here. So, pollen wasps, they are a group within the vespids. So these are wasps that I think a lot of people are familiar with our yellow jackets and our hornets, our paper wasps, potter wasps. Those are all different types of vespid wasps, so the family Vespidae. And pollen wasps are this subfamily within this group. The subfamily's name is Masarinae. And so they have that same sort of story where the rest of the Vespidae, all of their ancestors and relatives, are carnivorous. And, say a lot of paper wasps, you can picture them, they're gathering caterpillars to take back to the nest or something. And this is the same case where there's that transition from, as you said, our animal protein into our herbivorous lifestyle. They're basically eating plants. Pollen is more specialized, maybe part of plants, but the pollen wasps are utilizing plants to feed to their young. So with this transition, the pollen wasp and the bees, they are not very closely related. There are lots of other types of wasps and ants that are actually kind of, let's say, in between these two on the tree of life. But as I said, it's kind of a parallel story because from work that others have done on bees and the age that they're estimated to be their origins about 125 million years ago, I've done some work with the pollen wasp. They originate around that same time.
Really?
So I find that sort of comparative analysis there is really interesting. So let's say they originate about the same time. Why? Well, as with many other insect groups, we have this new resource, the angiosperms. So there are already different types of plants, and angiosperms were around, but they really were rising to dominance at about, say, 125 million years ago, 120 to 80 million years ago. They were really taking over the terrestrial ecosystem. So that's when we see that some of these groups that were able to utilize them, and yeah, anything that eats a plant, a lot of, we see our caterpillars and various beetles. They were probably also proliferating at this time. But then again, our pollinators, our pollen provisioners were too. So those are some of the parallels between these two. And with the bees and the wasps, they also, I should emphasize the bees and the pollen wasp, they potentially originated in around the same geographic area too, this area of Western Gondwana. So we've got this was back when Africa and South America were basically touching until 100 million years ago or so, and fitting together like puzzle pieces. And this was an arid, a drier region. So it's likely that from other analyses too, that the bees arose probably in that geographic region.
Yeah.
And the pollen wasps are also extremely speciose, especially in South Africa, and could have arisen around that area too.
Okay, so there's this abundance of this new resource or like growing resource of pollen, which the plants are using for reproduction, and that seems to independently, although in the same maybe general area at the general same time, these two lineages of wasps kind of like flip and they
Mhm.
start to provision their nests not with like other little insects, but they're starting to provision it with protein. Did the pollen wasps do are all pollen wasp lineages, do they revert back, or is it always but once they stuck with this, they stuck with it?
Yeah, well, that could be a very interesting other puzzle piece. So, and I could kind of add a little context there too with bees. There are about 21,000 species. Really, none of them have reverted back to carnivory. Some do some different things with brood parasitism. Some do eat or go on to like say dead meat, and we'll use some of that to provision their nests. But with the pollen wasps, we have so few species. There are less than 350 species of pollen wasp, and it actually appears that there may be an intervening lineage. Really, now there's been some speculation and hypotheses based on morphology, and now that we're using newer kind of molecular, like really large scale data, it is appearing as if there is another little lineage that's basically just in the middle of pollen wasps. We do recognize it as a different subfamily, and they're carnivores.
Ah,
So this would be really the first big example where a pollen provisioner has just switched whole scale back to hunting.
okay.
So that would be the only example we have of this instance of something like that life history happening. Mhm.
I wanted to pick up that. Well, that's fascinating, but it generally sticks together. But it's not. They're not as you mentioned. It's not as speciose as the bees, although they originate about the same time. Where maybe let's back it up. Like, where is the spatial distribution of? Do we have them in the Pacific Northwest? Do they are they in Europe? Where's their spatial extent? And why do you think they're not as, why didn't they proliferate in species like the bees did?
Yeah, well, starting out with just the geographic distribution today, both bees and pollen wasps are generally found worldwide. Bees more widely spread than pollen wasps in drier regions. So the pollen wasps are found in our region, which is great to have a study system here in the Pacific Northwest. They're really speciose. I already mentioned in Southern Africa. They're also in Northern Africa, and they do extend up into Central Europe. And then over just into Central Asia, just barely hitting India, but nothing in Eastern Asia. They're found in Australia, especially around the coastal regions there. And then, yeah, in the Americas, they are found in South America, and there is one genus in North America. And these are the same regions bees are found, but bees are just more widely distributed than that, but also especially speciose in these areas. And yes, it is a question of why do we see this discrepancy? From some analyses or research I've done, it does, I mean, we can definitely point to the fact that the pollen wasps just do not speciate as quickly. They have a lower diversification rate. The big question is why is that? One hypothesis is potentially some things having to do with what their food breath is. So all pollen wasps are specialists. They eat for their larvae. They're going to use just generally one genus or something very limited amount of plant material and the plant host that they go to. Many bees are also specialists too, but there are a lot of generalist bees also. At this point, we are just asking questions, trying to find parallelisms again in the two. And sometimes it's just a chance event. When we have something so rare as pollinivory that's evolved just a couple times. There is one other instance of one species in Sri Lanka that's also not related to these, but if we only can study just a couple instances of this, it could just be some chance event back in history, and it could lead to our different diversification rate. So it
Well,
really is kind of an open question.
is it is it more successful to have, is it a sign of more evolutionary success to have many species, or is it more complicated
Yes.
than that?
Well, it can be. People can define success in different ways, but generally, when we're speaking of success, it is number of species that we see like extant alive today. Hmm.
Okay, all right, good. Phew, I'm glad that was that's what I was going to say, but I didn't know. Well, okay, I really want to get into the life history of pollen wasps. I'm sure our listeners want to hear more about it, and maybe way into asking this question is, maybe the parallels with bees because we're sort of familiar with them. So how
Hmm.
close do are these parallels, and are there distinct differences between their life history?
Yeah, well, within Hymenoptera, and maybe, some of our stinging Hymenoptera, the aculeate wasp, a lot of them follow about the same general lifestyle. Most all are solitary. In the case of bees, at least 90% of the species are solitary. Pollen wasps, they all are. And so usually, especially in temperate areas, then the life cycle is just one generation per year. And so that would be the same with both of those. And it is that the female is then mass provisioning her larva. So a female, after being mated, would in mated in the spring and then in the summer be basically finding an appropriate place to build a nest or construct a nest of some sort. From there, building little nest cells. In the nest cells is where all of the provisions go. In this case, pollen provisions with an egg laid on those two and then closed up. So that's the
Okay.
same there across the board. One major difference is that most all bee groups, you see a lot of pollen on their body and they have these branched hairs, which are, of course, great for holding on to those pollen grains. And so the bees usually have some sort of scope, a place to hold the pollen on the outside of their body. There are a few that carry it internally, but the pollen wasps, they do ingest the pollen and carry it internally, which would be a
Oh.
difference for those two also. But and that's that step where, taking the provisions to the nest, they're carrying them a little bit differently. But really, they're often found in both of them, kind of more open areas, the scrubby vegetation, not usually really heavily forested areas. They're providing some sort of nest that they're just kind of constantly building and adding nest cells on. Mhm.
Okay, so these aren't big, fuzzy, you know, Daidasia like bees. They're swallowing the pollen,
Mhm.
and are they effective at transferring pollen?
Yeah, they do still have hairs. So the pollen wasp, if you're going to picture them in your head, they do look a lot like yellow jackets, let's say, except they have these really great antennae that are bulbed at the end.
Bulbed
Um,
antennae. Oh,
yeah, so yeah, you're going to see a little knob at the
is
end of
that
the
kind of like
antennae.
if you see something that looks like a yellow jacket with a bulbed antenna, is it a good
It's
chance?
it's a good chance that it's a
Okay.
pollen wasp then
Okay.
around here. Yeah. And so they do still have hairs, and there is still going to be pollen transferred on their body. Pollen still, let's say, as if the female is entering a flower to collect pollen, there still will be pollen grains stuck on different parts of their body, and they can use their legs to wipe those pollen grains closer to their mouth to ingest them. But there's still basically a mechanism to transfer pollen for pollination, for flower to flower.
Okay. All right. So one thing I want to pick up, what do these nests look like? I imagine like
Yeah.
bee nest, there's probably a variety, but what is there a kind of
Mhm.
like motif to a pollen wasp nest?
Yeah, well, I'll talk specifically about the ones that we have here in North America. This is a genus Pseudomazarus, and these are going to be mud nests that are usually attached to a rock or kind of maybe the underside of a rock or hard surface. They can be attached to vegetation also. And so it might look a little cone shape, and as it's being built, nest cells will be open at the top. So it's basically sometimes the nest cells can basically be in a line. It's basically a nest made of dirt and then pollen or some other water
Hmm.
that's used to push it together. So if you kind of think of mud nests that you might see, like mud dauber nests or
Yeah.
something, it would be like that, except you kind of can see individual nest cells a little more.
When you go to other regions, is that kind of generally the pattern? Kind of like an external nest sort of mounted to something?
It can be a little different, especially like I mentioned some in South Africa that those may be more, they'll be ground nesting. You might
Huh.
see a little turret.
Okay.
And that would be kind of like a ground nesting bee or something too. You might, or an ant. You think of an ant nest. And so that would look a little different. Yeah. Hmm.
When you're a cavity nesting bee, you sort of are just building your partitions, but I guess they got to kind of build a base
Hmm.
and then start to, like, it must be a lot of work before you start
Yeah, I
provisioning.
think over several days. I mean, of course, then just the provisioning itself, it's trips out and then back in
Huh.
too. Hmm.
Wow, amazing. Well, okay, tell us in the Pacific Northwest, you mentioned we have this one genus. Say it again.
Pseudomazarus. Um,
Pseudomazarus.
yeah, and
Okay.
and really there's a genus Mazarus over in Africa or those areas of the old world. And so this is one of the closest relatives, the the close relative of that is Pseudomazarus, yes.
Okay. Oh, one thing I remember when you talk to the volunteers, the master melittologist volunteers, is that they have these very specific plant, like they're very specific plant hosts. Tell us about the plants that, if you
Mhm.
wanted to see these, where would you spot them?
Yeah, well, really, if you look for basically two major genera of plants, those would be the ones that you'd be most likely to find these wasps on. So start with Penstemon and this genus of plants. I, it's also called the beard tongues for common name there too. This genus of plants is in North America, and they have pretty conical shaped flowers. Really, the corolla is pretty tubular there. And this genus will attract one of the largest species of Pseudomazarus, the Pseudomazarus vespoides, which also kind of gets its name looking like a vespid or a wasp like that.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so that's one of the genera. And then the other one is Phacelia. And the common name is also called scorpion weed for that one. Those are more open flowers with the open corolla. And really, a majority of the different genera of our North American pollen wasps will be utilizing Phacelia for their nest provisioning. So there are 15
Huh.
genera of pollen wasps in North America. One is only found in Mexico, but 14 can be found throughout the Western US, basically over into about Kansas and Texas. And so that does extend up into British Columbia also. So there are several species, some of which are just not really well known. Definitely, biology, life history, like the specific details of many of these species are not too well established. Mhm.
Well, that brings me to my final question. I know this is an active area of research for you, and what are the pressing questions in this field right now when it comes to the, life history, but also the evolution of pollen wasps, and what are your specific interests? Like, what are you working on?
Yeah, well, there's a graduate student in my lab who just finished up, and he was really just, I mean, starting out with characterizing this genus, Pseudomazarus, the North American pollen wasp. There was not phylogeny, so our evolutionary relationships, if you think of the branching relationships, ancestor descendant, we did not have that for the species here in North America, some of which are really rather geographically restricted and so, may need some attention. Right now, we don't know enough
Mm.
yet exactly do they need conservation attention or not. We do know that they can visit different species of flowers that have been of concern or like a threatened species of penstemon, that sort of thing. So I think there's some connections there. Basically, first just establishing where can we find the pollen wasps
Oh
today?
no.
What flowers are they visiting? Gathering more information on that and looking at their evolutionary history, which we mentioned, like the number of times Carnivory arose, kind of figuring out some of those higher level relationships.
So The last thing you said was we don't really know the conservation status of some of these, and some have very restricted
Ah,
ranges. And you
okay.
were talking about, some penstemons, for example, are being listed, and that was where if you could pick that up again,
Okay. No, I can. I
we'll stitch it
was trying to
together.
remember what I said after
Start
that.
with your graduate student. Say you had a graduate student who was,
Okay, yeah, I'll kind of just start the idea over then. Okay, so for instance, one question has to do with just our North American pollen wasp, this genus Pseudomazarus. And I had a student in the lab who recently finished up and did this really great project gathering distribution records, any sort of life history data on all these species. And basically what we're trying to do is find out how are all these species related, because we did not have a great idea of that. There had never been of phylogeny. So this evolutionary branching pattern, our ancestor descendant relationships there, when you kind of picture the Mazarus or the Masarine family tree. Okay, so we're still establishing those sorts of relationships. But also what he was able to find looking at the records, we know that many pollen wasps are rather geographically restricted. And we don't know what this may mean for their conservation. Really, just a lot more study has to be done. And that would be in terms of the pollen wasps themselves and how they interact with their host plants. So we do know that some of the Penstemon species, and for instance, one is listed as threatened. And so these pollen wasps visit that have been noted to visit that flower. What does that mean for both the health of the plant or the wasp? So I think there's questions there along the lines of just learning more about them and getting kind of a baseline information about the pollen wasps in general. And then there's also kind of some of these bigger evolutionary questions. For instance, we talked about, and this being a really rare event, well, maybe looking more into how did this arise, what we can learn today from some of the genetic underpinnings of being able to basically feed your young pollen that they can digest and be successfully raised on pollen instead of a carnivorous diet. And that comes back into more comparative analysis with bees. It's not just that these questions apply just in the smaller group of pollen wasps, but the really important pollinators being the notable group that with 21 million species or 21,000, excuse me, species described there. So I think it really is wide open, especially with more genetic and genomic tools that we could use to explore some of these diet breath switches.
I love that idea because I can imagine it is quite difficult to evolve the capacity to digest pollen. And imagine just that transition from a little bit of it to your main diet. It must be associated with some, maybe some common biochemical and morphological shifts that it would be fascinating to see if they were parallel and consistent amongst the groups, or if there have been multiple ways to do this.
Hmm. Yeah, there's different reasons why it would be hard to digest pollen with the physiology there. Some of them just like the mechanistic aspect that the pollen grains are really pointy and can kind of tear apart the gut of the insect if they're forced to eat it. But and also different secondary the compounds, the defensive compounds already in the plant that an insect may have to overcome in order to kind of capitalize on the good part of the pollen. So yeah, I think a lot of questions there. Mhm.
It also seems, I have to say there's a lot of people working on bees. And although this group may not be a specios, it must be, exciting as a graduate student. There's whole areas that are unknown. There's like a horizon that
Mhm.
is, tangible. You can make a real impact devoting study to Masarines.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great point because if there is so much to learn out there, you can kind of take things your own direction. You don't necessarily have to have the same concerns like, oh, well, there's already this group doing that, or this lab group's really established right there. It's a little bit more open. Hmm.
Well, thank you so much for taking time to tell us about these fascinating insects. It's really opened my eye. And I will say, as somebody who studies bees, it really has caused me to reflect a little bit on what exactly this shift meant. So this has been really, I hope this is for our listeners as well. It's been a real
expanded horizons.
Yeah, thank you. I hope so too, Anthony. It really was a pleasure. I'm glad you invited me and that I was able to speak here. And so, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.